Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this is episode 125, which were this a comic would probably be some kind of double-sized special because it's a multiple of 25, but this is a podcast. So in this regular-sized non-special episode, we'll be covering the first 6 episodes of Season 2 of Star Wars The Mandalorian, the hit Disney Plus series that is redefining here's a character from the canon which you could look up on the internet afterwards. And then we'll be looking at Redfork, a new small-town US horror comic by Alex Packnadel and Neil Vendrell from the third wave of titles from relatively new publisher TKO Studios. But before all of that, Alistair, what else have you been consuming in the last fortnight?
So I've been watching a French sci-fi detective show that's on Netflix. It's called Ad Vitam, and it's quite an interesting show. It's sort of set in near future. It's not hugely precise, in a world where people no longer die from old age thanks to this sort of regeneration technology they have. But this has created quite a few social problems. There's too many older people and there's sort of they're rapidly running out of sort of space and resources. They've also raised the age of being an adult to 30, or basically the point where you could start regenerating. So there's a lot of young people without much to do milling around. There's also a lot of people who seem to have lost the sense that there's any meaning in life now that there's no death, or lots of people don't die, which has sparked the rise of things like suicide cults. And the show sort of follows a detective who's brought in when a group of young people's dead bodies turn up on a beach, and they think it's the return of a suicide cult from 10 years ago that was quite infamous and killed quite a lot of people. So he then teams up with one of the survivors of said cult who's in an institution to try and get to the bottom of what's going on. And in typical detective story style, there's conspiracy, there's twists and turns. Things aren't exactly what they seem. It's quite an interesting show, and it's got a good sci-fi premise, and it's got a good detective thriller plot line. So yeah, I'd recommend it.
Wait, so death hasn't been eliminated entirely because you can still kill yourself?
Yeah, it's not like people are immortal. Although they're not 100% precise, it seems to be you can only die if you choose to, or something really bad happens to you, like you get shot or blown up, for example. But yeah, the regeneration technology will keep you young and healthy, and it seems to cure cancer or any other aging disease. If you want to, you can just keep living forever, providing you don't accidentally, get hit by a bus or something like that. But there's a bit when someone gets shot in the chest, one of the characters, and they kind of drag them into the healing thing and they survive. So pretty much death has ceased to exist. But then, yeah, obviously, like these people in the suicide cult, if you shoot yourself in the head, you're done for.
Well, it's like the ending of The Good Place, only more bleak.
It has its bleak moments, and I guess being like a French show, and this is the sort of stereotype of French TV and films, there are quite a lot of scenes of people sitting around discussing the philosophy of, does life have meaning without death? What is the point in existence? I suppose there's also, considering a lot of the characters are people who've been involved in suicide cults in one way or another.
So is the idea that suicide cults are more mainstream now that it's the only way to die?
Well, I think it's kind of wrapped up with the issue of there's sort of a lot of listless young people who don't know what to do with themselves, and this kind of, it maybe sort of some comment on some kind of extremist ideology is creeping in. There's another sort of group of young people who want to overturn the system, or it's not precisely define what they want, but they're basically a group of people who are angry about how young people are treated and how you basically don't have any rights till you're 30, which is interesting, I suppose. I guess the idea is that there's a lot of unhappy, angry young people in this world of adults, and some of them are drifting towards political action, some of them are drifting towards just killing themselves because they're angsty teenagers and they think life is pointless.
So if you stay young forever, at what point do you stop aging?
You kind of go back to the age I think you are when you first regenerate. Like the main character is quite interesting. I guess I didn't look up how old the actor is, but he must be, I don't know, in his late 40s, early 50s. But the character's supposed to be something like 120.
Oh.
There's a rule that you have to stop being a detective after you've served 99 years, and he's just coming up to his 99th year as a detective. But he also, there's a plot line involving his backstory in which he was one of the first people to have the regeneration technology tested on. So yeah, I guess he stopped aging in his like 40s or early 50s or something like that. But yeah, there's a lot of people. It's kind of a weird show because like one of the villains is supposed to be very, very old as well, but it's played by a woman who must be in her mid-30s. It's kind of odd when she goes around saying things like, when you're as old as me, you get to lecture me on eternity or something like that. It's like, you look younger than I am.
I mean, I watched, a load of seasons of Buffy and Angel and stuff. There's lots of young people banging on about how old they are. I mean, hell, I've seen Torchwood.
Yeah.
The immortal John Barrowman.
Or Interview with a Vampire, when there's the kind of, is it Kirsten Dunst plays like a 12-year-old who's supposed to be like 200?
Well, yeah. ultimately, it's a pretty standard trope, isn't it? The young hot person who's 400,000 years old.
There's a lot of crossover with sort of vampire stories and things like that. Maybe it's some kind of a metaphor for this technology sucking meaning out of the world, or, things like that. I guess they're exploring similar issues, which is, if you live forever, what do you live for? Which I'm pretty sure is the tagline of at least one vampire movie.
Yeah, I can't remember which one, but yes, you are right. It sounds very familiar. Or maybe it's just, capturing the essence of the whole thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the concept sounds interesting. The actual show's good as well, then.
Yeah. No, it's entertaining. There's some twists and turns along the way. The conclusion is quite satisfactory. My only strike against it is it does do one thing that I find really annoying that a lot of shows do, which is there's one episode, I won't say which one, which is basically a flashback.
Can I guess? Does it cut away to a different bit of out-of-context backstory, or a character who has been off-screen until now, or retells existing events from a different perspective? Is it one of those?
Yep, exactly,
okay,
yeah. It's the, they fill in one character's backstory and you see the events from their perspective, but you already know the major events because they were in the scenes with the other characters. I mean, after the first few minutes when it kind of just fills in a crucial bit of the story, the rest of the episode is basically all the stuff you've just seen before, again, but just from a slightly different perspective, which is a trope a lot of shows seem to fall into. I don't know, I've seen a lot of shows do it. I think American Gods had an especially bad case of that at one point.
Yeah, maybe just because there hasn't been quite as much new premium telly being burst out this year due to the state of things. I don't quite remember the most recent time I saw that trope, but yeah, there was definitely a period where it seemed to be everywhere.
It was the sort of thing that like the Marvel Netflix shows would do when they've got like 13 episodes. One of them would be like utterly pointless. Yeah, other than that, it's good. And I'd recommend it, especially if you like your foreign language sci-fi, as I do. It's an interesting French show. It's very stylishly, slickly done. If you like a good sci-fi thriller, something that blends detective with sci-fi, then it's interesting. So yeah, this is definitely something I would recommend. And I believe that if you could live forever, what do you live for is Twilight.
Of course it is. I mean, what else was it going to be, really?
Anyway, I've been watching French sci-fi detectives. Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, although this episode is not sponsored by TKO Studios, we are going to be covering a fair chunk of their output as well. But as anyone who knows much about my comics intake might be able to guess, they had a sale on. So I bought a couple of their other books that I've been meaning to read, and at the same time I read Redfork, I also ploughed through these. So this was Sentient by old podcast writing favourite Jeff Lemire, who also wrote Descender and Black Hammer and various other comics, almost all of which are good. Jeff Lemire is a very reliable creator. I also bought Sarah by Garth Ennis of Preacher Punisher fame and Steve Epting. And yeah, I read both of those. And yeah, they're both in a similar vein to Redfork, which we'll get to in a minute. I probably shouldn't start reviewing Redfork yet. They're both kind of enjoyable, 6-issue, slightly movie-ish, single discrete story type events. Sentient by Lemire and Walter is about a group of kids on a Ark spaceship looking for a new homeworld, and all the adults are killed due to plot reasons. And so the ship's computer has to raise these kids as their mother, and it's a bit of a tearjerker. You might be able to guess. It's about, these kids coming to love this robot, and then inevitably they get into trouble. Will the kids survive? Will the robot survive? The whole tear-jerking parent-child relationship thing is something Jeff Lemire's done a lot in his work, and this is another very good example of it. And yeah, Sarah is a war story by Garth Ennis. They very much hired the creators to do their signature thing here, because Garth Ennis has done a lot of war comics in his time. He's done so many war comics, but we have actually covered a Garth Ennis war comic on this show, although it did also have the Punisher in it. But yeah, this is about a team of elite female Russian snipers in World War II, and the main character, Sarah, is the best and most widely admired / feared of these Russian snipers who could just kill people at random in a ghost-like fashion. And then one day she finds that her unit is also being picked off by a sniper, and they have this sort of psychological sniper-on-sniper showdown. Again, it's really good. It's very much Garth Ennis being given a load of pages and a really, really good artist and just let loose to do his thing. And yeah, probably not the best Garth Ennis war story I've ever read, but in its defense, there are literally millions of them. Sorry, there are literally hundreds of them, but probably not actually millions. But nonetheless, yeah, it's another good one in the oeuvre, and the art is gorgeous. Steve Epting, who's previously done some Captain America stuff, he did Velvet with Ed Brubaker as well. This kind of realistic action thing is very much his oeuvre, sort of people with guns slowly and ponderously contemplating their actions. It's a lovely, lovely comic, Sarah. In fact, yeah, they're both really good. TKO seem to be sort of laying out their standard as these sort of high production value shorts comics released in lumps of a few every year.
This sounds really interesting. I mean, looks like TKO are getting some comics royalty involved. I mean, they're sparing no expense when it comes to recruiting talent.
Yeah, each wave has 4 of these 120-page books in it, and they seem to be balancing it with one writer who's genuinely quite big.
And I guess being a small or newish publisher, they don't have the thing that most comics rely on to generate sales, which is well-known characters. There's no Batman, Iron Man, so on. So they, rather than having well-known characters, they've gone for well-known writers and artists, which makes sense.
Yeah, they haven't got any IP to fall back on. I get the feeling, I don't know, I listened to quite a few comics interview podcasts, and the publisher of TKO did do a bit of a mini media blitz a year or so back when they were getting going. And yeah, I get the feeling they do have at least half an eye on the old media exploitation down the line. I couldn't be entirely surprised to see Sara the movie, or Sentient the movie, or Redfork the movie in the medium-term future. But short term, in terms of the comics, they're definitely trying to get buzz by bringing in respected creators.
And they sound really good. The one, was it Sara, about the Russian snipers, sounds right up my street.
It is really good, and for the record, as of this recording, and hopefully as of this release, you can get it on Comixology for like £4, I think. I think it's still on sale. So yeah, that's pretty affordable for 6 issues of high-quality Garth Ennis war angst.
So that's good. And this is a straight-up war story. It's not a fantasy thing or war sci-fi thing. Not that that's a deal-breaker. It's just it's always interesting.
Yeah, there's no sci-fi fantasy elements. It's just set in World War II in the boring old real world.
Yeah, cool.
When Sarah shoots someone, they stay dead.
It's always good, I guess, to find new publishers who are bringing some life into the comics industry. I mean, maybe that sounds a bit harsh. The comics obviously are very similar to film, well, probably because a lot of comics get made into films. But from the perspective of the outside, people say like, oh, it's just the same old thing, yet another Marvel film, yet another sort of Batman comic. But obviously, some of them are good, some of them are bad. I mean, I remember having, again, discussions with people who don't go to the cinema that much and they just say like, oh, there's just so many crappy superhero films. And it goes like, well, they're not all crappy. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But it's also interesting when from the outside you do see a director or studios doing something interesting or something different, or trying to maybe be a bit more of an auteur or carve out a distinctive style that's maybe not so blockbuster friendly but is interesting. So I guess this seems to be like a similar thing with this new publisher.
Yeah, I mean, there is a certain level of cynicism in some quarters in comics about publishers who are clearly, lining up the IP for future adaptation. But I think TKO have mostly gone around it by, I think, the talent is pretty high quality. They seem to be just giving people as much time as they need to finish these books to a high standard. And although I've never actually bought any of the physical comics because I am a digital puritan, they are, I think, from what people have said, have quite high production values and stuff. So yeah, there is enough focus on making the comic a nice product.
Yeah, and I guess ultimately if they're entertaining stories, that's the most important thing.
Well, yeah, and comics, even some of the more non-superhero, air quotes, credible comics, often go for the desire to do the 5-year ongoing series, like 30, 40, 50 issues. So there's something quite appealing about this sort of graphic novel model, basically. They are nominally broken up into 6 chapters in this sort of vague nod to serialization, but they release them all at the same time, so it's kind of irrelevant, really. They are basically just graphic novels.
I suppose it's also similar to kind of more a Netflix distribution model where you release it all at once so people can binge through it if they want to, rather than having to wait week by week.
Well, yeah, I think they are very much trying to be to some degree the Netflix of comics, albeit with a much smaller catalogue. So anyway, yeah, this episode not sponsored by TKO, but yeah, the few TKO comics I've read are pretty good. I'll probably somewhat cherry pick based on creators, but I'll probably give at least some more of the others a shot.
And if you stick with the episode, you'll get another TKO review in a few minutes.
Yes, we'll be talking about Redfork in however long it takes us to talk about The Mandalorian.
Next, we will be discussing the second season of The Mandalorian, which follow Pedro Pascal's Mandalorian, who searches for a Jedi to train Grogu, aka Baby Yoda. We've seen the first 6 episodes of the second season. That's all that's out right now in the UK. So, Nick, what did you think of the story so far?
I really like the first season of this, and the second season is one of these sequels which is very much, yeah, you like that? Here's some more. The Mandalorian wanders from place to place, he meets them, he does them a favour. Some of these people are from extended Star Wars lore. In fact, this season, almost all of them have been from somewhere in extended Star Wars lore. It's still kind of fun in a brain-off, high-budget way, and the last episode did raise the stakes in a way that made me think, oh, good, about time. Maybe I'm just more beaten down by lockdown and miserable than I was when I watched Season 1 in March. But yeah, the trudging journey of the Mandalorian is starting to feel a bit trudgier, maybe? Once again, I ended up binging the bulk of this in a fairly straight run of about 5 episodes, and that probably didn't serve it super well, because watched in a row, the slight sameness of it does become hard to ignore. I've noticed quite a lot more remarks on Twitter about how every Mandalorian episode consists of him, going somewhere and being made to run errands for someone in exchange for the thing he actually needs. Someone on Twitter compared it to a video game. You go to a location, the person goes, yes, I can give you what you want, But first, you must shoot that dragon for me. As I say, it is picking up a bit in the final few episodes, but part of me does hope that they've broken the formula to some degree, because it is starting to get a tad formulaic.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've been watching it in a different way. I've pretty much watched it week by week, every Friday as it's come out. I agree that it's probably served a bit better that way, that the very episodic structure sort of makes more sense with a gap between each episode. I can imagine if you binged it, you would very much be of the opinion this is quite samey. And even watching week by week, you do get a point when it is quite samey. And I am kind of wondering where it's going to go. They can't go on forever, just have the Mandalorian carting Baby Yoda from place to place looking for a Jedi. I mean, that's going to get quite dull by like the 5th season. Overall, I am finding the show really, really fun. It's one of the sort of the highlights of the weekend. There's a lot of good action scenes. There's a lot of quite spectacular bits. There's, it's always entertaining. It's got that kind of Disney relentless competence that every episode is like, entertaining. There's nothing that's kind of dull. There's no boring, pointless flashback episodes. I guess the sort of Star Wars superfan in me is kind of appreciating some of the delves into the canon or sort of Star Wars lore. Certainly, 10-year-old me was extremely excited to see Dark Troopers finally become officially Star Wars canon. I think the original Dark Forces, I may even played that video game before I saw my first ever Star Wars film, I think. So that was a big moment. Overall, yeah, my critic in me says, it passes the entertaining sniff test.
Well, yeah, I mean, as well as very possibly watching it a bit too quickly, I must admit I'm not as big a pure Star Wars fan as you. Like, Dark Troopers mean nothing to me. I'm sure they're very nice people. Or something.
Very much the opposite, but
I'm sure I should give Dark Troopers a chance romantically. But
yeah.
It doesn't stir anything in me, apart from, fear, I suppose. And, I'm impressed in some way by the level of deep lore they're going for. Like, because I have the internet and I dabble with, various nerd content sites, I do get, told fairly quickly when someone who's appeared in The Mandalorian turns out to be somehow important to the canon. Like, obviously, I do know who Boba Fett is, because I have seen the original trilogy. But yeah, I know that the Timothy Oliphant character in episode 1, the sheriff dude with Boba Fett's armor, was apparently from Chuck Wendig's novels. The character played by Rosario Dawson, the Jedi, in the 5th episode is from the Clone Wars show.
Yeah, Grand Admiral Thrawn, who's been mentioned, is he's from quite a lot of extended universe stuff, but originally the Heir to the Empire novels. But yeah, he's a kind of a fan favourite from this sort of extended canon.
Yeah, and I gather the ice planet they visited, I think the one with all the spiders, is actually from the Dr. Aphra comics by Cy Spurrier, which is nice. If nothing else, they're definitely servicing the old extended universe this year.
I find it quite interesting, because obviously I do love Star Wars things and love nods to things from my childhood, like, reading Heir to the Empire stuff, which must have been one of the first books full-length grown-up novels I read, and things like playing Dark Forces and things like that. But obviously it's one of those things that, like, although fans do love nods to the extended canon, obviously it can be alienating to the average viewer, even the sort of person who really likes the films but doesn't dive into the kind of the wider universe, and it can't get in the way of telling a good story, because obviously too much that's what people describe as fan wanking, isn't it? Just throwing in stuff that fans will love but everyone else finds confusing. What I've been doing as well as pretty much each week, as well as watching The Mandalorian each Friday, is watching Star Trek Discovery as it comes out. I won't drop any spoilers, but Star Trek Discovery seems to, at certain points, have really gone down the corridor of digging up obscure bits of Star Trek canon to kind of weave into the plot. Again, I know this is what fans want, and fans get annoyed when they get given something new, such as they got annoyed by the new tone of Discovery, or Star Wars fans really didn't like The Last Jedi because it didn't feel very Star Wars, among other reasons. I mean, and I did like The Last Jedi. There is an important balance to strike between giving fans what they want, giving them something new, and telling a good story. I think ultimately The Mandalorian does always come back to, it's always entertaining, it's always accessible. So I think they get away with it, but it is a difficult game to play.
I think they largely put off the fan wank insofar as it doesn't feel like, excessive wanking. It doesn't feel like it's getting in the way of the plot. Like, as I say, I'm not that bothered about Grand Admiral Thrawn or the Rosario Dawson Jedi character, but the fact that they appeared in other media wasn't, it didn't feel like an advert for that other media. The fact that they are characters who've appeared elsewhere was just a thing. I mean, I don't know, it does sometimes feel, it's weird. On the one hand, it didn't bother me that they'd appeared elsewhere. On the other hand, it did sometimes feel that their episodes didn't have a lot to them other than, introducing those characters. Like, there were times where this could almost feel like a series of extended trailers for possible future spin-offs or movies, or maybe just episodes of this show. I don't know, like, some of the plots, especially in the early half of this season, feel a bit like busy work, which, again, is just me making the same point again about how it's sometimes starting to become a bit of a trudge. But at the same time, Baby Yoda Grogu is still cute, and Mando's rough yet lovable tough guy routine, it's a bit tropey, but it's the tough guy with a heart of gold Western thing they're doing, and it's very endearing, and it still works. And it's an easy show to watch. I very rarely mind watching it while I'm watching it. The production values are still amazing for TV because Disney Plus are throwing the kitchen sink full of cash at this. It's a hard thing to really aggressively criticise. It just increasingly feels at times slightly hollow. Like afterwards, I just come away thinking, okay, yeah, this really isn't gonna do much, is it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of not really blazing new ground in terms of Star Wars, a lot of the original films have the similar sort of, they're mainly for kind of spectacular entertainment. I'm kind of in the process of re-watching the original series of films once a week, just as something to do during lockdown, and they're all like incredibly entertaining, and obviously they were technically innovated when they came out and really kind of pushed the boundary of filmmaking forwards and inspired a lot of passion from the fans. And I guess this is, I think, in keeping with sort of Star Wars in that, yeah, it's got the essence of Star Wars in it. But I guess what I would say about The Mandalorian is that it's not sort of strikingly original, and you don't feel like a huge bond with the characters. Like, as much as you'd really like The Mandalorian and want him to succeed, and Baby Yoda is very, very cute, it's not like you look at them and you kind of feel, oh, I see myself in that role. I've been through that. I can relate to that. Whereas even other shows, I've not been in situations you do have that response. I watched recently, and we talked about this podcast, The Queen's Gambit. I've obviously not been a female chess player in the 1960s, but you kind of really relate to the character who's struggling with something and trying to achieve something and coming up against opposition. There's that kind of deeper emotional connection, which sometimes, I know, The Mandalorian doesn't have.
I don't know. Even that's maybe harsh insofar as, they've clearly got the emotional base of Baby Yoda and the Mandalorian's relationship, which works pretty well considering Baby Yoda is a non-real puppet. He's still, adorable. They still throw in just enough Baby Yoda every week for it not to feel completely like they're just pandering to us, although they are clearly pandering to us a little bit. Yeah, I don't know, it's a hard show to hate, but I increasingly find it a hard show to aggressively love.
I wonder where it's going is an interesting thing. I mean, there's a big cliffhanger for episode 6, which there's probably no need to spoil, but there'll be, I guess, you get an indication of where the last 2 episodes of this series are going. Again, I don't know how interesting it would be to see a 3rd series of just The Mandalorian carts Baby Yoda from planet to planet. But I mean, surely they're not going to keep on just doing this over and over.
Well, they have commissioned the 3rd season, so who knows? I mean, I do think episode 6 was good and did move things along nicely. Maybe they should have just got to episode 6 earlier. I don't know. Maybe episode 6 should have been episode 2 or episode 3 or something, and it would have felt a bit more like an exciting series of sustained events without quite as much wandering. I mean, they are, I don't know, checking back in with the old characters. It doesn't feel like every episode's a complete waste of time. It just adds up overall to this slight sense of meandering.
Yeah, I do really like the creative team that they've pulled together. I mean, like episode 6 was directed by Robert Rodriguez, who's obviously, a high-profile action sci-fi director. They've got Jon Favreau, who's done quite a few episodes, Bryce Dallas Howard. They've got great people involved, and the cast is always excellent. Obviously, we mentioned Pedro Pascal. Carl Weathers is back in this series. Nick Nolte turns up. Rosario Dawson, we've mentioned.
It was good to see Timothy Oliphant playing another sheriff Western type role.
Yeah, exactly. We do love Deadwood. Katie Sackhoff from Battlestar Galactica.
I'd actually forgotten she was in it. Yeah, another space sci-fi luminary.
Yeah, that was an interesting thing they threw out. Other Mandalorians who follow a different way, a similar way, or a slightly different creed, who seem to have grand ideas about recapturing their homeworld. So that's another interesting plot line they throw out. They often throw out really good side bits and stuff, and you think kind of, where will that go?
And to their credit, stuff normally comes back. Like, they've just revisited, again, a very mild spoiler for the most recent episode, which will be a week old by the time you listen to this, so hopefully that's fine. They've just revisited the Ming-Na Wen character from last year, and I imagine Katie Sackhoff will be back one way or another. I'm less sure about Timothy Oliphant and Rosario Dawson. If anything, Rosario Dawson did genuinely feel like she might be an attempt to set up a future spin-off series. But, I don't know, Katie Sackhoff, I would be surprised to see her come back in either the remaining 2 episodes of this or the already commissioned 3rd season.
It's a high-profile bit of casting, and considering that she's specifically a Mandalorian with views about the Mandalorian world and their creed, so it seems like a likely fertile future territory for this show to explore. The Rosario Dawson, I mean, obviously they set up her with a plot line that's interesting in that she's hunting Grand Admiral Thrawn, who we mentioned. They're setting that up. I mean, again, it's for its own show, but it would be fertile ground for them to cover in a later series of this show.
Well, yeah, it's one of these things which, in the past, you just assume it was a later plot for this show, because, the show is the show. But because this is, the Disney Plus Star Wars Extended Empire, you hear them dropping these, plot hooks, and you think, okay, so is that for this show or a different show?
Who knows?
Show, don't tell.
But yeah, exactly. I guess that's just the age we live in now. I mean, there's plenty of shows in the past that have thrown out plot lines and then just failed to acknowledge them or never pick them up again.
It is also entirely possible it's just more grist for the nerds, yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, again, I mean, we will be covering more spoilers for our amazing final few minutes of this episode. We will be covering more Star Wars related material next episode in our festive holiday themed special. Just there's a little clue there. But if I have dramatic, exciting new opinions of the last 2 episodes of The Mandalorian, maybe we'll revisit it in that episode. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, there certainly won't be any dearth of Star Wars material to cover. So yeah,
it'll be back. Don't worry.
Finally, this episode we will be discussing Redfork, a new graphic novel by Alex Paknadal and Neil Vendrell. When Noah gets out of prison, he discovers that Redfork, the mining town he grew up in, has problems with opioids, unusual diseases, and scab miners brought in to break up a strike. There's also a mysterious man named Gallowglass offering a solution to all their problems, but at what cost? We've read the entire graphic novel, so Nick, what did you think of it?
I enjoyed this quite a lot. It's got a nice sort of cinematic horror pace to it, with the added bonus of being able to pull off some sort of dramatic creature effects that a lot of films might struggle to do still, even in the modern age. I've now read 3 TKO books in total, with, the 2 I mentioned earlier. And although this isn't my favourite, it is another strong outing for their model, and it's a nice example of a genre story that is still obviously very genre, but it's a little different from the genres that often get flayed out in comics. Like, it's very focused around, for the bulk of it, human conversations and human interactions and subtle moments of creepiness, whereas a lot of comics tend to just go in for the big image, because that's what, splashes on the page. But, there's quite a lot of gentle, subtle interactions, especially during sort of the first 2/3 of the book, getting steadily more creepy until it sort of ramps up towards this final showdown. And yeah, it's a very straight genre piece. It might, I don't know, if you've read a lot of this sort of small town horror, maybe it's quite straightforward, but I think it's a very well made, well executed piece, and yeah, it does a good job of grounding itself in its main characters and its location. So yeah, really enjoyed this.
I also really like this as well. It's, very much up my street. As you say, it's a small town horror thing. I did really like how it took on issues in contemporary America. Really embraces the small town setting. It's dealing with people who are struggling with like poverty, opioids. Several characters have problems with like opioid dependency. There's people suffering from the sort of diseases that the mining industry, that kind of cluster around sites of mining industry activity, supposedly coincidentally, such as the main character's father is kind of laid out with black lung from breathing too much coal dust. It's a company town very much. There's people struggling with medical bills. There's single parents, dysfunctional relationships, all the kind of problems of like poverty and sort of small town hopelessness are kind of summed up. And then that's all sort of weaved in with the horror element of this mysterious man appearing. Again, using a fairly classic trope of, I can solve your problems, I can make things better, but you have to kind of serve me and work for me in my nefarious scheme. And obviously, it's a very much a Faustian bargain in that way. But it's interesting how it's weaving in around it, like, what he does cure one person of their opioid addiction and things like that. And as a sort of portrait of contemporary rural America or contemporary small town America, it's one of the best and kind of most affecting portraits of that part of society that I've seen or read. So I thought that was excellent.
Although it doesn't get into contemporary politics really. I don't think there are any like massive obvious allusions to Donald Trump, but it's the idea that, I don't know, recent modern politics doesn't really help these people, and, there's a level of sort of desperation in small town America as mines close and jobs dry up and stuff, and it does a nice job of sort of portraying this undercurrent. There's this sort of sense of desperation and hopelessness, which is then preyed on by the villain Gallowglass, which the book has a very good job of starting off with and then building steadily as the character comes back to this town Redfork after his time in prison and sees how badly things have, gone to shit. And how increasingly struggling everyone is, and this sort of sinister change that comes over it. So yeah, a lot of it is about atmosphere, which makes sense because it's a horror book. And again, it's a very well conveyed atmosphere. It builds very sort of slowly and subtly, and the art does a good job of portraying these sort of subtle variations.
Yeah, absolutely. The art was gorgeous, as you say. The towns were this sort of beautiful hues of dark greens and browns and stuff, gave it this very sort of horror movie look of everything kind of being a bit decaying and a bit grim. There's quite a few sort of quite violent bits, and there's quite a few creepy, disgusting body horror bits that really come across very well in the art. It's really quite visceral with some moments and quite kind of bleh. The horror side of it really worked.
Well, I talked a lot about the sort of subtle build-up, but when it gets to time to do something properly yucky. That's there as well. They do pull off that.
Yeah, it's kind of structured quite well. I can see how you say this could be a good film in that it's kind of got the first bit when basically things are kind of normal and there's some weird stuff going on in the background and there's a mysterious person and you don't know if they're good or bad, and they offer a Faustian deal to the characters, and then it just switches, which is, fair enough. They're like, right, we're done with the ambiguity bit. This guy's bad news, and then horrible stuff starts happening really quickly. Like a lot of TV shows have this bit when like, okay, it's obvious that the bad guy is bad, but the penny hasn't dropped for the main characters yet. But yeah, this one just horrible, nasty stuff starts happening. The main characters all realise this is all bad news, and then it pivots into the second half, which is more violent and more horror-y.
Yeah, I don't know. I mentioned earlier this might make a good TV show. That might realistically just drag out the plot a bit more. I think you're right in that one of the things that works about this is that, it doesn't really mess around with the audience by having this long bit where you've got there and you're waiting for the characters to get there. This version does, just get through the plot in a fairly efficient way and just get to, the meaty stuff. And I think that's worth preserving, probably. So yeah, I think this is probably the best version of itself. But yeah, don't wait for the adaptation, just read the comic. Yeah, I mean, having roundly praised the whole thing, and I do thoroughly recommend this, it's really good. The ending maybe felt slightly rushed to me. I always felt like he could have used 5 or 6 more pages, but it didn't, massively undercut the rest of it.
I pretty much have the exact same note, which is, if I had one criticism, it is that it kind of got to the end and kind of wrapped itself up quite neatly. I didn't really like the denouement right on the end, which we shouldn't spoil for anyone who's going to read it. Like the last few pages, the sort of end was excellent, but it did do a sort of, we built up all this stuff, and then it kind of, it just sort of wraps up quite neatly. Maybe, an extra issue probably would have made it too long, or an extra chapter. But yeah, you're right. Maybe if they could have a couple of extra pages, maybe to wrap things up a bit more convincingly. But it's not a major criticism. It's just a slight blemish.
Yeah, I don't have the TKO style guide handy. I've no idea how, militant they are with those page counts. If it was just a case of, you can't have those extra few pages. But yeah, I thought that is the one part of this which didn't feel like a pretty strong, hard to argue with execution of itself.
I guess that's a digital publisher. It's one of those things like, well, I don't know if they're bringing out physical copies of this, but they're not constrained by page binding techniques that require like divisibles of 8 or whatever it is for page numbers. If it's digital, you can have the last issue be 6 pages longer just because it's the last issue and you need that little bit of space. Just like Netflix shows don't have to fit into 55-minute bits and have the ad breaks every 10 minutes. So, they can an episode a little longer if they want. But I don't know, I guess, creators used to working in the traditional comics, I guess they're used to working and writing the stories that way.
Well, I mean, they do publish physical versions of these. This is available in a book edition and in a box of the 6 single issues, if that floats your boat. So yeah, these are physical books as well. It's just me who's only reading them in digital.
Yeah, the setting and stuff was probably the thing I like the most about it. And as you say, it doesn't do capital P politics, like obviously like Trump or anything really political is not mentioned. I mean, partly it would just date it quite severely, and also it's not the story that they're telling, but it's definitely a small p political story about, again, like problems of opioids and poverty and deindustrialization and things like that. And what's quite interesting is that this is, although it's about small town conservative America. I mean, people have like flags on their porch and God loves America, or I think the main character's mum has on her door just says in big letters like God loves America or God bless America or something like that.
Yeah.
That's clearly there to send a message about these characters and what their politics are, even though it's not the story. But it is a very sympathetic story about how these people's lives are really difficult. They're blighted from everything from their town being poisoned to just a bleak sense of hopelessness. It's a very sympathetic portrayal of the problems of conservative America, the small town, the places that voted for Trump in large numbers. And I guess I don't know the creators, I don't know their politics. I guess on some level I'm assuming that them being creative types, their politics maybe leans more towards liberal.
I follow Alex Packnadal on Twitter, and yeah, he definitely leans that way, yeah.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you don't often see, again, in this age of polarization and anger, that someone actually writing what is a very sympathetic portrayal of the conservative parts of America, and it's quite striking in that regard. I mean, it reminds me on some level of King of the Hill in that it's a very sympathetic, almost loving portrait of small town America. It's almost like King of the Hill just with some horror in it on some level. But yeah, in the sense that we don't see a huge amount of portrayal. There's a lot of stories of people leaving these places and going to the cities to find themselves and things like that. I mean, there's plenty of Hallmark films about people returning to places like this, although they rarely have featured the opioid crisis or ancient evil gods living under mountains. But it's interesting in that regard.
Yeah, and I liked the density of the cast, I suppose. The fact that there actually are although this is a fairly, as a lot of TKO comics are, a fairly contained, slick, beginning to end story that, doesn't dazzle us with its massive scope for future sequels. It's just, very smoothly doing what it set out to do in these 6 issues. It does have quite a lot of different characters in it who are given a personality within the story. They have some nuance. The main character, Noah, has his parents, he has his love interest, he has his friends, and they all have, a few memorable traits to them, and they all have some sort of payoff and resolution. There's a lot of depth in there.
Yeah, exactly. That's almost another note that I've got exactly the same, is that the characterization is very rich, and everyone gets a sense of who they are, like everything from his mother, his girlfriend, his brother's girlfriend, his best friend. Yeah, you'll find a bit about them. And obviously the other main character is the woman who is the kind of owner and head of the mining company, who is, presented as an antagonist at first, which is quite interesting. But yeah, the characterization is excellent. Considering something that's quite small and short, it makes the characters really vivid.
Again, that's good writing, I guess. That sort of economy, that sort of managing to get, different, clear, distinct characters across with very little space. It's not showy, but it's a very strong and well executed.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this, listeners, Alex Packnazal also wrote a comic called Friendo, which came out last year, which again is in a bit of a relatively familiar genre. It's sort of Black Mirror-esque tech paranoia, sci-fi horror. But again, through sheer execution, it does still feel very fun and distinct. Recommend it.
Yeah, no, I really like this, and I would recommend it to anyone who's interested in, horror, or again, like things that kind of explore small p politics.
Yeah, good comic. Well done. Okay, and that was Moderate Fantasy Violence for this fortnight. Thank you very much for listening. As ever, you can get more Moderate Fantasy Violence affiliated content at moderatefantasyviolence.com, including essays by Alistair and a few bits and bobs clipped out from our old episodes. And if you've enjoyed all of that, you could also go to your podcast app of choice. Again, I gather, especially if it's Apple Podcasts, particularly good, but, we'll take anything. And leave us a nice review. Thank you very much.
You can also find us on Twitter, where we're at MFV Podcast, or on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can also find me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And you can find me on Twitter as at NickMB, or you can find more of my writing, including various comics I've written, both free ones and extra long ones you can buy, at nickbryan.com. And yeah, we'll be back in a couple of weeks with what is, I guess, our Christmas special. Jesus Christ. In fact, it'll be out on Christmas Eve, so yeah, like it or not, it's definitely our Christmas special. It's probably time I bought a present. In which we will be covering the Star Wars Lego Holiday Special, or is it the Lego Star Wars Holiday Special? One of those. And we'll probably, as I say, revisit the Mandalorian at least a little bit, if there's anything noteworthy in those final couple of episodes. And then we'll be covering, the even more festive end of the Christmas special, we'll be covering the festive special extra episode of Euphoria. So that'll be fun. Okay, see you in a couple of weeks. Bye.
Bye.
We won't be covering the old Star Wars Holiday Special. I've never seen that. And I don't believe it's on Disney Plus due to the level of incest.